As a Taylor Swift historian, I feel like The Tortured Poets Department is Taylor Swift's most widely misunderstood album, and it's barely even been out for a week. And I feel that way for a number of reasons. Firstly, the amount of lore and context clues that are required to really understand in a very basic way half of the songs on this record is naturally quite alienating to the casual listener, of which a music reviewer typically is. Secondly, the events that she's writing about were deeply controversial in their occurrence and their nature, and that has, but of course, spilled out into the reception and the discourse surrounding the release of this record. On Tortured Poets, Taylor is truly letting her freak flag fly. No stone goes unturned. For better or worse, this album is deeply human and incredibly honest. Of course, honesty does not guarantee artistic merit, but it does take a certain commitment to the bit to display your inner machinations at Taylor Swift's level of success for the whole world to see with seemingly very little or no varnish at all. Taylor paints herself, perhaps at times unintentionally, at various points throughout this record, in quite an unflattering light. This is a huge narrative shift from her confessional records of yonder year, where she was always presented as either the victim or the hero in the stories that she was telling. She is not necessarily settling scores on this record. Instead, she is poking fun at her own motivations to bring chaos into her own life, messy and freewheeling as it becomes. At times, this record is the maybe I'm the problem tour de force that her earliest critics were begging for in her country days when she was accused of not being able to take accountability for her role in the demise of her relationships. There is a deep chasm between the critical perception of this record and the artistic merits of it. I truly believe that. And there is also a chasm between the Swifties' understanding and reception of this record and of Taylor's intentions artistically and what it means for her legacy. I feel like there's a lot of missing the point going on. What's so interesting about Taylor as an artist is how we witnessed her sense of righteousness, something that really used to guide the principles of her work, decline in real time after she took stock of her artistry during the folklore and Evermore era. Taylor Swift's albums used to be about packaging these neat, tidy lessons that resonated deeply with the universal listener, transforming the personal into the universal meaning. This man broke my heart. He betrayed my trust. These are foundational, relatable human experiences that you don't have to be a pop star to resonate with. But since her life has grown more and more unrelatable and her experiences with love have been tainted by that very deep and intrinsic unrelatability, naturally, Taylor has been pushed into the gray area, a space where she has never really been comfortable, but is finally kind of interrogating on this record. And I think that that is one of the most important things about it when you're looking at it just from a content perspective. Our narrator is undergoing an emotional transition, and this is reflected all over the record. There are moments of brilliance and moments of confusion throughout this record. The best way to describe it is uneven. I really do think that's a fair way to assess this record. But it's not a career-ending sign of her artistic decline, as so many reviews have pointed it out to be, nor is it her best work ever created, as the Swifties are always quick to claim. Isn't it interesting how no matter what album comes out, it's instantly better than anything she's ever done before? There is a middle ground to take, and I would like to take that approach with you today. This is not an album review. It's more of a first thought, knee-jerk response to the discourse that I've been seeing online. Part of the problem, I think, with the reviews that I've seen so far is that they take no time to sit with this record and to let it marinate. And more than ever, I really think this record needs some time. Critics and fans are rightly frustrated and overwhelmed by the sheer length of this project, and they are too close to it to form normal opinions about it. Have you noticed how insane most of these reviews are? Music criticism has changed so much in the social age, where publications once got screener copies of albums a few weeks ahead of their release so that they could, publish a considered and thoughtful review of the record as it came out that would guide the consumer to whether or not they might want to invest in this album or not. In the streaming age, this is less important, and publications are not granted access to this anymore, especially when it comes to Taylor Swift. Why? Because Taylor's kind of obsessed with having the final word. I mean, as she should. It's her brand, it's her image, it's her music. T-Pain is the queen of gatekeeping the brand image. And so now the only people who get pre-listens for the records, who could theoretically deliver a good and insightful take on it as it comes out, rather than people who are rushing just to file their bylines because they literally had to listen to it with everyone else as it dropped and turn around an article the next day. The only people who get that opportunity now are the sycophants, the people who will never utter or issue a criticism of Taylor Swift in fear of souring their relationship with her publicity arm. A great example of this is Rob Sheffield from Rolling Stone. He is literally not a critic, he's a fan, and he's a fan on the payroll, basically. To him, every album she creates is her best and can do no wrong. If you go back through his reviews of her records, he basically says the same thing every single time about it, and Taylor also having a bit of tyrannical control over who gets access to her music as well, definitely, I would imagine, ruffles feathers the wrong way in the music criticism sphere. But that's just conjecture. So as I mentioned, all the other journalists who are not given preferential access want to capitalize on the traffic of a Taylor Swift record cycle. And, there's no incentive in waiting. I'm included in that. I also have to churn out my content very quickly when Taylor does something. But I will not be delivering a review of this record in any sense because this work is too complex and too important for me to give you a hot take about it. And that's what many of these reviews are. They are first impressions and not a review in the truest sense. So I think it gives a bit of an unfair skew. It focuses more on Taylor's position in the culture rather than the actual work itself. Writers are under pressure to turn around strong opinions very quickly, not just any opinions. And guess what? Rage bait works. Presenting a review as mixed, giving it a bit of a salacious headline works, and the Swifties fall for it every single time. So, you kind of have yourselves to blame for some of these reviews as well, because you engage with it, you feed the beast. Personally, I find reading the critical response to any record that I'm interested in is a super important part of developing my thoughts about it. I like to see how other people are interpreting things that maybe I interpret differently, and my best advice to anyone who's interested in pop culture and likes to think critically about it is to find writers whose work you resonate with and appreciate, who write about what you're interested in, and whose voices you trust, and listen to them, or at least, pay attention to what they're saying when something important to you comes out. And also, another thing to remember is that not every negative review comes from a place of misunderstanding or is a half-baked opinion. Everyone is entitled to say how they feel about a body of work, even if you don't agree. I have experienced the negative side of this when I simply suggested that Midnights was, even though a good album that I enjoyed, not worthy of Album of the Year. I endured weeks of online harassment, death threats, you name it, and I didn't even say it was bad. People don't even watch the video or read the article. They just go off of like a thumbnail or a headline. And that is designed to get people to click. So those two things are not always aligned. But what I find to be unacceptable, however, for example, in this review cycle, is the pathetic and weak editorial direction of Paste magazine, who published a scathing and also a rather unfair screed against Taylor in their review of the Tortured Poets department. It's written in the most snotty, self-congratulatory, obnoxious, and arrogant voice. And yet the writer isn't brave enough to stand by their words. It doesn't matter how much you think you're going to get attacked. If you can't own your words, they have no place existing in this world. Imagine for my Midnights video that I just told you I got attacked about relentlessly for a week, I showed up anonymously on YouTube with a bag over my head. Nobody would take it seriously, and they shouldn't, because part of building trust in the publications and the, sources of media that you consume is understanding and knowing who they are. That's like the fundamental principle of journalism, is to be honest. A horrible decision by Pace Magazine, and one that cheapens their entire journalistic enterprise, but more on that later. Before we get any further into the video, I must implore you to subscribe to my channel, because over 50% of you that watch my videos are not subscribed, and that's so mean. I really wish you would rectify that right now. My name is Zach, I'm the Swiftologist, and I make thoughtful weekly videos about pop culture. Obviously, it's a lot of Taylor Swift content, and there's a lot more coming up, from the podcast, Evolution of a Snake, Patreon linked below. There is just, the things are in different areas. If you have any suggestions about things that you would like me to talk about, specifically when it comes to Tortured Poets, or any phase of Taylor's career, or even any other pop music lately, I've been really wanting to talk about Chapel Roan. That's for sure coming up. Let me know in the comments below. With the Tortured Poets department introducing a whole new lexicon of imagery, text, and meaning to the Taylor Swift cinematic universe, I've decided that I need to get ahead of this girly and prepare for any future surprises. I really do think she's going to add more dates to the Eras tour, with maybe even a revamped Tortured Poets set, or even a completely new tour in 2025. So I need to be saving my coinage for that. And I recently found out, to my surprise, that I was being charged $45 a month for an editing software that I never used. I guess I just downloaded a free trial and then forgot, but it took me so long to figure out how to cancel it because the settings were honestly a labyrinth, and that was probably on purpose. But luckily, today's sponsor, Swiftologist, is Rocket Money, and they are here to help me and you never get charged for something we use ever again. Rocket Money is the personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower bills, and manage your money better. I'm using Rocket Money to safely and securely identify these recurring charges I'm telling you about and cancel unwanted subscriptions for me on my behalf. I can even cancel them from within the app itself with just a couple of taps, so there's no need to deal with the labyrinth of settings and customer service calls. I'm also using Rocket Money to set budgets and analyze my spending habits, because too often I thrust my credit card forwards and forget about it later. Rocket Money automatically monitors your spending by category and notifies you when you exceed your budget limits, which is something my ADHD brain needs to receive. Rocket Money has helped save its customers up to $740 a year with over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. Think about how many Eras tour tickets $500 million could buy. At this rate, 2 or 3. To save more and spend less, join the over 5 million members using Rocket Money today. Go to rocketmoney.com/Swiftologist or click the link in the description to get started for free. You can also unlock even more features with premium. Thank you so much to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video. Back to talking about the critics. Here are some critics who have written about Taylor for years, whose perspectives I actually really appreciate. John Karamanica from the New York Times. Olivia Horn wrote the Pitchfork review that I think was a little bit controversial. Amanda Petrusic writes always beautifully about Taylor for the New Yorker. I would include Sam Lansky, but his clearly stage-managed profile of Taylor for Time magazine has made me doubt his ability to think critically about Taylor in public. So struck from the record currently, but I hold out hope. He's a really good writer. I can't remember a time when a Taylor Swift album was met with so much controversy, though. Now, I'm not sure that that's exactly the right word to use, but this album is extremely polarizing. Tortured Poets has come out to as much fanfare as it has blowback, and the response to this record has truly been mixed reviews. I have actually, believe it or not, seen mixed reviews even from the Swifties themselves. Many fans who were, shall we say, onboarded into the Taylor Nation post the Lover era, aka the majority of people now in online spaces making all the noise, have never had to contend with a messy Taylor Swift in real time. They have only met messy Taylor in hindsight while she was in a love-happy relationship. Some people are furious that she's devoted this much real estate to Maddie Healy, and some are disappointed in her for crucifying him. Some are also even, committed to deliberately misunderstanding her and applying their own deranged interpretations to even the smallest and most minute detail as an absolute statement of fact. Everybody on the internet claims to be spitting facts these days. The cumulative effect of all of these voices in social media and all of these reviews coming out with very strong language is that there's a lot of noise. It took me a few days to really sort out how I feel about this record, and what I'm prepared to say at this point is that as a longtime fan, I really appreciate the highs on this record, and there are many high points and stunners that have entered instantly into my personal Taylor Swift canon. However, I do think that Taylor's period of hyper-productivity has reached a breaking point, and whatever comes next needs to be radically different to this for the sake of her artistry and for her legacy. Getting comfortable and doing the same thing repeatedly with the same collaborators is death by 1,000 cuts. It lowers the quality of the overall output. Stuffing a record with a few 10s, many 7s and 8s, and an even split of below that also dulls the shine of the real standout moments. Taylor absolutely does need an editor, but she doesn't need someone else to do that for her. It's perfectly within her skill set to edit herself. She is more than capable of doing it, and we see that on this very album, which is something that I think the critics are missing and have not given credit for, the breadth and depth of the work here. Okay, so now let's get into some specific points that I would like to address from some of the reviews I've read and what the Swifties have interpreted with their meth math. The first point that I've seen from critics that I generally agree with, and Swifties seem to be unable to process, is that Taylor is overwriting. Before this record came out, I predicted that it would be full of lore and somewhat alienating to the casual listener, and this has proven to be true. Taylor has always been known to write direct, intimate, and confessional songs. She steered away from autobiography for Folklore and Evermore, and then returned to a very half-baked, evasive narrator's position on Midnights. Tortured Poets is kind of an overcorrection on that front. She is rushing through so much detail and working with so many extended metaphors that it can be like waterboarding the audience with detail. Sometimes you need to come up for air, and detail does not necessarily give meaning. The point of including small biographical writerly observations is to make the situation that you're writing about come alive in technicolor for the listener. For example, I gave you all my love and you left me, but I know you want me back. That is, an interesting universal thing to say. How can you more powerfully say that with, some writerly observation? I left my scarf there at your sister's house, and you've still got it, even now. Taylor Swift's best written songs are actually deceptively simple. The power of any good writing is its ability to transform the personal into the universal, and Taylor is a master of making her heartbreaks your heartbreaks. But there are moments on this record where that clarity falters. A very straightforward 101 creative writing rule is to show, don't tell. Showing is letting the story unfold with actions, thoughts, sensory details, and feelings. I walked through the door with you, the air was cold, but something about it felt like home somehow. The brilliance of that, and the simplicity of it. You're transported to where she is and filled with a longing, all in a combination of very simple, easy words. You don't need a thesaurus to work that one out or to really feel the depth of emotion there. I want to turn to a song that I actually really like, but I think is a good example of overwriting and is in need of editing. When you use too many words to say something very simple, it can come across as kind of try hard or clunky. Down bad. Did you really beam me up in a cloud of sparkling dust just to do experiments on? Tell me I was the chosen one. Showed me that this world is bigger than us, then sent me back where I came from. This is kind of a lot of imagery to deal with at the very beginning of the song, and it feels especially jarring because the chorus really doesn't continue the cosmic love vibe of the song. It goes straight back into more realistic writing. I'm down bad crying at the gym, everything comes out, teenage petulance, F it if I can't have him, etc. Of these two examples from the same song, what works better? Not which sounds nicer, but which stanza gives you the clearest and most immediate picture of how Taylor feels. You don't need to imagine or be patient with the chorus. It announces and explains itself. On this record, Taylor does suffer from a kind of entry-level creative writer's curse, which is strange because she usually doesn't write like this, where she tries to jam as many words and images as possible into very tight constructs. The pop song is not a very forgiving form. There is a logic it needs to follow, and at times she's pushing up against the possibilities of what it can contain. However, that can work when it's done well. But Daddy I Love Love Him is an excellent example of this. The whole song is committed to being completely over the top and exaggerated, plus it's imbued with a sense of humor too. That fourth wall break shows you that she's not taking any of this too seriously. She's also referring back to a mode of writing she's done before. I'm stupid in love at any cost. The central line in this song is screaming, "But daddy, I love him." To be frank, that is a patently ridiculous image to have of a 34-year-old needing to scream at her father in a petulant teenage manner that she loves this man. It was not ridiculous when she wrote it on Love Story because she was an actual teen, but my daddy said stay away from Juliet and I was crying on the staircase begging you please don't go. But here it is absurd, and it doesn't matter because she's fully committing to the bit and we recognize this from her. It just works. She's also not really working with metaphor all the way through this very long song. Though it's wordy, long, and rambling, the writing is actually very grounded in reality. I'll tell you something right now. I'd rather burn my whole life down than listen to one more second of all this bitching and moaning. I'll tell you something about my good name. It's mine alone to disgrace. I don't cater to all these vipers dressed in empaths' clothing. Now, the image here of vipers dressed in empaths' clothing has been picked up in so many of the critical reviews of this record, the same ones that criticize the writing, as one of its best lines. So why does this work memorably and the down bad verses sound kind of strange or out of place? Because this line is not surrounded by other metaphors that are confusing, bogging it down. It's preceded by a bunch of plain statements of facts that are in and of themselves charged with feeling. I'll tell you something about my good name. It's mine alone to disgrace. Lindsay Zolas for the New York Times wrote a pretty tough but sometimes fair review of this record that kind of directly contradicts a point that I'm making here. She says, "It is to the detriment of the tortured poets department that a certain starry-eyed fascination with fairy tales has crept back into Swift's lyricism. It is almost singularly focused on the salvation of romantic love. I tried to keep a tally of how many songs yearningly reference wedding rings and ran out of fingers. By the end, this perspective makes the album feel a bit hermetic, lacking the depth and taut structure of her best work." Now, this is where I think that the critics not understanding Taylor Swift and her iconography or her purpose as a songwriter starts to betray itself. But Daddy I Love Him is undoubtedly a standout track on this record that does exactly what the writer is complaining about here. It's in this writer's opinion that Taylor's lyricism is too singularly focused on the salvation of romantic love. What's funny to me about this is I'd like to know what Taylor Swift Lindsay Zolas has been listening to before this. When has that ever not been the central focus of her work? Sure, she takes detours, she writes fiction-inspired things, but her best 24-karat tailor-plated songs are completely and totally about her starry-eyed fascination with fairy tales and the salvation of romantic love. Love Story, You Belong With Me, Mine, Enchanted, Delicate, Lover, Willow. And that obsession with the salvation of romantic love has an opposite response too, the power it has to dismantle her, which also yields 24-karat tailor-plated songs in various hues. All Too Well, We Are Never, Wildest Dreams, Dear John, Death by a Thousand Cuts, Better Man. I could go on and on. The salvation of romantic love is Taylor's most deep and inspiring muse, and it's also what draws people to her in the first place. I don't really know what she should be writing about otherwise. It's only natural for someone who is very much guided by her romantic life to be fixated on something like a wedding ring, which is the eternal promise of forever love. Plus, she's kind of at the age where society expects women to settle down, and she's being kind of brave in admitting that this is something that she wants, while also suggesting elsewhere on other songs that even though she wants this, the societal expectations, the 1950s, you know what they want from her, places an undue pressure on her shoulders. What Lindsay Zolas is getting right here, though, is that this album does feel a little bit hermetic. There isn't a lot of room to breathe. Taylor is dialed up to 100 on almost every single song, and when you dial up that far on every moment, it makes your misses seem just as big as your hits. I think what Swifties don't understand is that you can like something or it can have an impact on you without it being the best thing ever created of all time objectively. A good example is my journey with Who's Afraid of Little Old Me, an album highlight for most Swifties and an obvious clunker for the critics who have reviewed this record. Here's what Lindsay Zolas again had to say about that particular song. "It would not be a Swift album without an overheated and disproportionately scaled revenge song, and there is a doozy here called Who's Afraid of Little Old Me, which bristles with indignation over a grand booming palette. Given the enormous cultural power that Swift wields and the fact that she has played dexterously with humor and irony elsewhere in her catalog, it's surprising she doesn't deliver this one with a much needed wink." To the author's credit, this song is a lot to handle. It's not very clear in its intention or its purpose. Taylor randomly at the beginning, before she even goes on about the circus, kind of suggests that she's directing this song at a specific person. The scandal was contained, she says, but she does not go on to clarify in any meaningful way who that is directed about or where the song is intended to land. It kind of rambles on and gets lost as a very angry meditation on fame, but it's not a meditation because it doesn't really grapple with the questions being raised, nor does it actually even raise any questions at all. This is the bad part about her hyperproductive era. Not everything that you write that sounds smart or sounds good has artistic merit or a creative impact. If you take the song off of the tortured poets department, it does not change the story or make the album worse. We'll get to what the story of this record is a little bit later on. The bridge of this song is literally a word vomit of non-connected images. She's toothless at the circus, and then she's a witch in her cave drunk on her own tears. She's levitating down your street from the gallows, and then she delivers this line. They say it's not about me, but what if it is? She doesn't clarify what she means here, and there is no inflection of humor. It hangs in the air. And in the context of how all-encompassing her public image has been, this ends up sounding a bit sinister, or perhaps even arrogant, rather than an intelligent comment on her present condition as the most famous person in the world. And I hate to say it, but this song is far too long. It has no business being over 5 minutes long with having so little to say. Compare this rambling to the rambling on But Daddy I Love Him. There are so many images presented on Who's Afraid of Little Old Me that not one immediately sticks out as the kind of hallmark moment. On But Daddy I Love Him, it's the vision of her running with her dress unbuttoned, period, point blank. There's a reason why the Swifties love a song like Who's Afraid of Little Old Me, though. We care about her lore. We're invested in every inch of her story, no matter how inelegantly she expresses it. We are the crowd screaming more, 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 and she's in a phase of hitting her marks. She's in a place in her creative journey where she simply has that excess to give. In a conversation between critics for the New York Times, Ben Cesario points out that over the years, he's trained himself to view Taylor's work through the eyes of her fans. He says that it's crucial for understanding Taylor, whose connections with her listeners is at the root of her success and has also become part of the art itself. The question, he says, is not just what is Taylor saying, but what is she telling her fans, and how will they respond to it? Well, it seems like no matter what she says now, she will be intentionally misunderstood by her own fans, the people that want to project their own delusions onto what these songs are about. Something that's been so frustrating as a commentator in this album cycle is how aggressive people are becoming about their interpretations of who or what these songs are about, and their willingness to ignore or their inability to stick to the text as a primary source of evidence. Suddenly, everything is literal. The literalism of this fandom really serves this record absolutely no favors because of how writerly it is, and how many details there are that are just sadly going to be misunderstood by the lowest common denominator. This idea that no one can have an interpretation of these texts without an agenda also really impedes our ability to think critically about the project as a whole as well. For example, let's talk about The Alchemy. In my opinion, my reading of the song, that song is quite obviously about the Maddie Healy interlude. I explained why in detail on the podcast, and I will not repeat myself here, but there are, to me, inarguable textual references that indicate who that song is about. And yet the Tavists among us are completely enraged that I don't agree from my own textual analysis that it is not necessarily about him. And again, I have never claimed to be the final authority on who these songs are about, but I only want to entertain educated guesses. I seriously had someone say to me in an extremely rude way that the definitive proof that this song is about Travis was that Taylor Nation tweeted a football emoji with the song during a listening party. An exchange that followed in the comments between the Tavis shippers went on to discuss how I am obviously biased, and I obviously don't like Travis, and I don't care about Taylor's happiness, and I don't want her to be endgame with him. This is the dumbest conversation ever, and it's happening all over my comment section. People really feel like they are living Taylor Swift's life, and they need to police other people who don't want to engage with their version of her life. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I have no personal investment in Taylor Swift's exes. They are interesting to me as characters on the page, and that's how I draw my conclusions about them. Part of Swiftie culture for a long time that many people don't understand is dunking on the exes for comedic effect. I do this a lot, and it gets misinterpreted as bullying or whatever the hell you want to call it. I'll pick back up on that later, Taylor writing about her exes and what that means, but I truly don't care about her exes. There isn't one that I hate more than the other. There are some I find boring, the heirloom turkey, for example, but it's not that serious. I'm not in his comment section doing speak up now. I'm not coordinating people to go and harass him. It's a kiki. These are all public figures. They signed up for it. I love Taylor dearly and I want nothing but happiness for her, but I don't care about who she dates. And Travis is included in that. I'm here for her music, and her legacy. The men are not part of that to me, other than ornamental decorations. And honestly, people are being extra weird about her relationship with Travis, and it's creeping me out at this point. Get a job. Listen to the music. Don't you have more interesting things to discover from this expansive record than just one or two max songs that could maybe be about Travis Kelce, a relationship that has barely started? No. You don't care about Taylor the artist. You care about Taylor the stand-in for the life you want with the football player as the blonde, hot, popular girl that you don't have. But back to misinterpretation. People are now revising the historical record and going all the way back to 1989 saying that that's about Maddie Healy. That can't be possible. Style apparently is about him now. The literal timeline does not work. She completed 1989 in February of 2014, and she didn't really meet him or properly start hanging out with him until after the record had already come out later that year. But no one wants to do their research. They just want to create another theory. It's really annoying. I won't even address the Gaylors because I don't negotiate with terrorists, so better luck next time. Someone said to me that Robin, the song about Aaron Dessner's child, is about Robin Williams. That song lyrically is so obviously about a child. You can't seriously tell me that you looked at those lyrics and said, I think this song is about a dead man that we don't even know if Taylor Swift ever met. Someone else said in my YouTube comments that The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived is about Scott Borchetta. That song literally contains the lyrics because it wasn't sexy until it was forbidden. So you think she was screwing this absolute pile of toxic human waste for years and then just all of a sudden decided to write about it on the Maddie Healy breakup album? Get real. Let's turn back to the songwriting on this record, because I think there's a reason why Taylor has done sensory overload in terms of the amount of detail she's included here. Lore sells. The mystical Taylor Swift cinematic universe, in which she is the only creator, the hand of God, is a fruitful place to populate. And there was a lot of ground to cover here, the Maddie interlude and the Joe breakup as well. I think for a long time, Taylor felt artistically constrained by her present relationship with the turkey. I talk about this in detail on my Jover deep dive, but trying to write about something while also trying to prevent your fame from killing that stifles you creatively in a sense. And it was under these constraints that she had to throw out the baby with the bathwater and completely try something new in order not to let her writing grow stale. This was, of course, Folklore and Evermore. And you see, that's the real value of challenging yourself creatively. You arrive somewhere new. But I digress. What I was talking about is that she has had a lot to come clean about ever since. Midnights was, whether you loved it or not, extremely vague and one of her least confessional albums. And confession is what she's known for. So this record was certainly an overcorrection to that. She's telling us everything we needed to know and then some. There are moments here of confession as well that aren't necessarily hers to share. There are multiple references made to someone else's drug use and sexuality, for example. I don't think it's wrong for her to include these things. It's part of her artistic license, but I do think that those kinds of accusations, remarks, or observations tend to land differently when her music is now this popular and also this picked apart. What you also must remember about Taylor is that nothing is revealed about her by accident. Everything you see and hear about her more or less has been approved by, the gods of the Taylor Swift PR machine. A good example of how closely her image is guarded came from a recent Wall Street Journal article about Tree Payne. A writer recounts how in order to profile someone who was opening for her on a tour, they had to promise that anything they observed about Taylor, no matter how mundane, her walking around in sweatpants or anything like that, would be off the record. If they didn't agree to this, they would not have been able to have access to the other celebrity who basically had nothing to do with Taylor at this point. I stress that to say that the details that Taylor shows us are never accidental. An interesting comment from Lindsay Zolas about the stunning Smallest Man Who Ever Lived was, "The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived is probably the most satisfyingly vicious breakup song Swift has written since All Too Well, but it is predicated on a power imbalance that goes unquestioned. Is a clash between the smallest man and the biggest woman in the world a fair fight?" I am personally team eviscerate the ex-boyfriend. They know the score going in. It's part and parcel with dating Taylor Swift, and I think this is a good example of how to the wider public it may seem unfair for Taylor to be divulging the scathing tea about someone who has no right of response within the work itself. However, all of these people are also free to speak their side of the story anytime they want to. They just choose not to because Taylor clocks them so bad with the lyrics. But Maddie Healy, I'm sure, will have a response when his eventual album comes out. But anyway, these kinds of details are things that Taylor kept out of her work for a really long time. Plus, as she said in her Time magazine interview, she often felt that her first 6 records were overcomplicated or that she was overthinking how they should be released. I have a lot to say about that. A missing piece of the puzzle in Taylor's prolific output, unleashing all of these songs upon us and just drowning us in content, is the fact that she is now completely in the driver's seat of her creativity. What we learned is that it may not have always been that way in the past, as slowly but surely details of her working relationship with Scott Borchetta have started to trickle out. She mentioned on more than one occasion that she had to really fight hard to make certain creative choices. She was only allowed to do a certain number of pop songs on Red, for example, and she had to really lobby for her full pivot away from country on 1989. These are frustrating things to experience when you can see your vision so clearly. But you know what else this resistance does? It forces you to sharpen your pen and make work that is so good, so obviously what it needs to be in this world, that your detractors and the gatekeepers have no choice but to stop fighting you on it, because it's that clear. It's also important to note that Taylor has never compromised her vision on these overthought first few albums. What the resistance of having someone with an influence in her decision had on her was that it made her fight harder for her creative choices and also come to a real sense of clarity about them in order to articulate them to be fought for. Great art is often born out of resistance, and we know this from her first 6 records, which were always created in some sort of response to a criticism she had read about her past album. What's happened from Lover onwards is that Taylor is entirely in control of her operation. The buck starts and stops with her. Those are the terms of her new deal, and that's how it should be. She should be the master of her destiny. But she should also have the foresight, as someone who has been writing for years and has put out some of the best pop music of all time, that a little bit of friction yields a stronger result. Her collaborations with Jack Antonoff and Aaron Dessner have been extremely fruitful, but they are starting to become lopsided and uneven. It's very clear that each of these men are not meaningfully pushing back on Taylor as a writer and forcing her to sharpen her ideas, to say what she needs to say in the best and most articulate way possible. In my opinion, the gold standard of a collaborator for Taylor is Liz Rose, who very much views her role as guidance, and even as is kind of a very hands-off editor. She's not a producer, she is a songwriter. She doesn't work with how the songs are going to sound. She focuses on what the stories are going to mean. And that, I think, is what Taylor is missing in the studio with her as she works with Jack and Aaron, who are more focused on what the vibe of the song is going to be. When Taylor took All Too Well to Liz Rose, in all of its glorious rambling 10 minutes, Liz, as the professional songwriter, said, "This is incredible, but you can make it even more incredible by whittling it down to its most clear, most gut-wrenching, and devastating lyrics possible." And the final result is an astounding career highlight, likely the best song she will ever write. Having the 10-minute version is an honor and a privilege, but the 10-minute version is not better than what made it onto the record. If it had come out at the time as a 10-minute song, we might not be looking at it as her best written song in her career. We only view the 10-minute version of All Too Well this way because of the powerful myth that the original 5 minutes created. How can a song this good have been twice as long? Well, we can see why it was whittled down. It's effective, it's stirring, but artistically, the 5-minute version is a front-to-back jaw-dropper that truly lets her lyricism shine. The most devastating lines in Taylor's catalog are not the mumbo-jumbo word vomit that exists not infrequently on Tortured Poets. The record references poetry and poetic imagery, but Taylor is really missing the cornerstone of good poetry here. You must kill your darlings. Returning to Lindsay Zolet's review, she described it perfectly. A palpable love of language and a fascination with how words lock together in rhymes certainly courses through Taylor Swift's writing, but poetry is not a marketing strategy or even an aesthetic. It's a whole way of looking at the world and its language, turning them both upside down in search of new meanings and possibilities. It is also an art form in which, quite often, and counter to the governing principle of Swift's current empire, less is more. Sylvia Plath once called poetry a tyrannical discipline because the poet must go so far and so fast in such a small space, you've got to burn away all the peripherals. Great poets know how to condense, or at least how to edit. The sharpest moments on the Tortured Poets would be even more piercing in the absence of excess. Lindsay goes on to argue that some editing would make the clutter go away, and then Taylor ends up holding an unlit match. I don't agree that the clutter here is so great and so loud that it drowns out the fire on this record, but I certainly agree with her point. Less is more, show don't tell. Let's return to an example of one of Taylor's best lyrics. I don't know how to be something you miss. Romeo, take me somewhere we can be alone. You call me up again just to break me like a promise. Darling, I'm a nightmare, dressed like a daydream. These are zingers. They contain entire universes in their walls. Detail for detail's sake that doesn't illuminate a wider meaning dilutes the message overall. The Tortured Poets Department, the title track of this record, is a great example of this. It has a beautiful hook. Who's gonna know you like me? Who will decode you like me? But it's surrounded by this superfluous nonsense. We declared Charlie Puth should be a bigger artist. I get that they're high or whatever, but the song is incoherent nonsense. It doesn't have a beginning, a middle, or an end. And this is supposed to be the thesis statement of the record. Olivia Horne's review of Tortured Poets highlights this point really well. If Swift believes that output for its own sake is what she has to offer, she underestimates her gift. Listeners who believe that her every ounce of experience is inherently interesting because she was the one to have it, misunderstand her as well. Taylor Swift doesn't need a whole album to tell the story of their relationship. She only needs one song, sometimes even one line. Let's revisit an album highlight to examine the power of simplicity, fresh out the slammer. In this sweating, sweltering Starpoint, Taylor is very clear about the conditions in which this album was made, just what she was running away from and why she ended up in the arms of a tortured poet. Bright and blue and fights in tunnels, handcuffed to the spell I was under for just 1 hour of sunshine. Years of labor, locks, and ceilings in the shade of how he was feeling. But it's going to be all right. I did my time. That one line alone, I did my time, and the way she delivers it is far more impactful than any lyric on the ridiculous Who's Afraid of Little Old Me and the excessive Tortured Poets Department. I should really come from My Boy Only Breaks His Favorite Toys because that metaphor is clumsy, but it's fun to listen to, and I'll spare her today. I also want to talk about the volume of her output. Dumping 15 songs on top of the meaty 16-song track list was honestly a silly thing to do in one day. We should have at least waited a while, like a few days or maybe even a week before these addendums were added into the lexicon. Like the general track list, this effort is uneven too, and it's also tonally incongruent with a lot of what else is on Tortured Poets. Most of these songs sound like Evermore rejects. I love that about them, but they don't really add to the story or the message of Tortured Poets, which just gets further lost and confused as you add more and more to it. I think because Taylor was forced to edit herself in the past and, occasionally maybe make some sort of concession, she is swinging in the opposite direction and saying, here's what I made, have it all at once. As a personal artistic decision, I can respect that, but there is another aspect to this. She's also gaming the charts. More songs, more streams, more records broken. There's a motivation here that can't be ignored when the quality is so uneven. If she included 4 bonus tracks here, it could have been something really special, but there's simply no need for another volume of this. Of course, everyone's automatic response is, be grateful, you're getting food, but I'm thinking more structurally highly about her career and her legacy. It's harder to admire Tortured Poets for its many excellent attributes when it's bogged down by a lot of middling work. None of it is particularly bad, and that almost makes it worse, because bad work from a failed experiment shows more artistic integrity than too many formulaic rote Taylor Swift songs. It's not as though the anthology is entirely bad either. There are perfectly good detail-oriented songs. The Black Dog is a personal favorite and a really moving highlight. The image of seeing your ex's location on your phone is so relatable to so many different people, but these highlights are dulled and blunted by the unnecessary additions of Robin and So High School, Peter and Thank You Amy, which add absolutely nothing to the story of Tortured Poets. She is trying to accomplish so much. She's taking all of these detours off the main road when the main road is actually compelling and interesting enough to follow. Let's return to the Pace review, which is complete hogwash and garbage, and is worth no admiration at all, simply because the writer wasn't brave enough to own their words. But there is one single line in it that stuck out to me, especially when I was reviewing the anthology. The Tortured Poets department reeks of because I can, not because I should. And that is the difference, I suppose, between a great and an okay Taylor Swift song. Using this line as a total indictment of the project is stupid, because Taylor herself has said that she needed songwriting more than ever while writing this, and she definitely has something to say. And that's no clearer than on a song like Love of My Life, which is some of the finest, saddest writing she has ever done. Dancing phantoms on the terrace, are they secondhand embarrassed that I can't get out of bed because something counterfeit is dead? It was legendary, momentary, it was unnecessary. That tells a whole story. There's a whole life in that little stanza. And this is the power of a Taylor Swift song. Another example of purposeful detail. Guilty as Sin is a lyrical highlight for me on this record. The lyrics do get a bit ridiculous here. What if he's written mine on my upper thigh, only in my mind? But it makes sense with the conceit of the song, which is about kind of driving yourself crazy as you cheat on your significant other, whom you are very unhappy with, mentally in your head, then feeling a tremendous guilt about it, even though you didn't do anything wrong, technically. It's so effective. We have the inclusion of downtown lights, we have someone telling her there's no such thing as bad thoughts. All these details really add up to a very beautiful and purposeful construction, and the payoff of Am I Allowed to Cry is so beautiful. And this is an emotional gray area that she has not really explored at length like this on any of her albums before. This song is an excellent rebuttal to one of the most idiotic claims made in that pathetic Paste article, which is that Taylor has run out of ideas. This is just plausibly laughable, because the issue at hand for me is that she has too many compelling ideas that aren't explored fully, not that she's drawing blood from the stone. The Paste magazine goes on to lament, the billionaire is having an identity crisis, but there are no social media apps for her to buy up, so she sings like Lana Del Rey and writes meta self-referential songs about looking like Stevie Nicks. Like it or not, anonymous, people are actually interested in the lore of Taylor Swift, and as other critics have pointed out, this is actually a unique selling point of her work, and something that you must understand in order to appreciate the work. We can all examine her fame, and hearing her interact with it can be very interesting. Lest we forget The Last Great American Dynasty, an excellent meta self-referential song. Clara Bow follows that position, and I find it's especially compelling on this record because of how sparse it is, and how simple the proposition it puts forward is. We don't get to hear much from Taylor about how putting in the work at the very beginning of her career was part of wanting it really badly. Lots of her earlier work hid that magic behind the curtain to maintain a veil of relatability and, oh shucks, this just happened to me, and I'm so lucky. But on this song, she describes her hunger for fame as something that she wanted so bad she might die. That is objectively an interesting meta-self narrative for anyone who's even remotely invested in her lore, or who is interested in the perspective of a famous person. It's an unrelatable experience, but it is something that is, of interest to most people. You know what's hilarious about this garbage review is that they tell on themselves. The reviewer says they hated Reputation when it came out, but now they love it because Tortured Poets is so bad. The Overton window on Taylor has shifted, and this was necessary because there was too much fawning praise, but now it's like seen as countercultural to say something negative about her. It's like cool to deliver that. And, sometimes there is a valid negative thing to say, but sometimes I think people are being negative for the sake of negative. During Midnights, Taylor was untouchable, and now people are just kind of clamoring to be the first person to throw a brick. This is a cycle that will unfortunately rinse and repeat. The difference is that Taylor has decided to stop caring, and I admire that when it comes to making music in the face of criticism. But as we say in a writer's workshop, a note can come from anywhere, even in between the lines of the most vitriolic, obviously biased review. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, for example. Another issue with the reviewing process is not just the rush to publish a hot take, but also the compulsion to deliver some sort of snark or takedown of Taylor's public figure in general. You have never read so many reviews that speak so little about the music. Even the Pitchfork review, which I like, spends far too long explaining Taylor's current stature. You are a music publication. We can get the reporting on whether she's too big or not elsewhere. Talk about the art. Taylor's prolific output is often tied completely to her greed and her billionaire status, and I said earlier that I think there is some truth to that. However, it seems that no one ever wants to consider the conditions under which she was creating her work for so many years before, that this voluminous output is a direct response to. Why? Because that would require applying a touch of empathy to your reporting on Taylor Swift, who is quite literally the world's punching bag every now and again. Taylor is not immune to criticism, and nor should she be. In general, I found most of the negative reviews to be fair enough, even when I didn't agree. One criticism that I very much agree with, and I think is probably the central problem on this record, is that she needs to move on from from her collaborative partnership with Jack Antonoff and Aaron Dessner. It has yielded everything useful it can possibly yield. We are trapped with diminishing returns if she refuses to branch out again. This creative partnership is probably, I guess, her second longest after Nathan Chapman. Something I've noticed is that Jack Antonoff does not edit the artists that he works with. He lets them steer the ship and eggs them on to be the most dramatic, visceral versions of themselves. And you can really hear that reflected in his recent output. His work on Lord Solar Power failed to push her in a less shallow writing direction. He will not rein in Lana's often absurd automatic songwriting that does devolve into nonsense. And he further complicates each and every dramatic analogy, image, or metaphor that Taylor creates with flat production that is no longer serving her artistry. I feel at times, at multiple points on this record, that the songs are being held back by Jack's one-trick pony behavior. And let me be clear, I love Taylor's work with Jack, and I love some of her work with him on this record. I don't suggest her to abolish him entirely and never work with him again, but the collaboration is growing stale. Aaron is a more interesting case, but his output with Taylor is incredibly consistent and samey. Each of these producers are more known for their production work, working with instrumentation and musicianship. They are not known for having a very clear insight into the process of creating a good piece of writing. That is an entirely different skill set. And someone like Liz Rose, who is not a producer but is just a songwriter, is the kind of person I think that Taylor could really make some interesting work with in the future again. Now that we've had 4 albums of Jack and Aaron, I think it's time to move on. I also think she needs a more diverse sonic palette and an actual writer like Liz Rose to bounce ideas off of who will push back on her. Jack Antonoff in his own right is not a good lyricist. His Bleachers music is horribly reviewed, it's cliche, it's vapid, it's shallow. He doesn't have the vernacular literally to keep up with Taylor and elevate her already formidable skill. Aaron's work with The National has declined over the years, and their lyrics are very vibe-oriented, not the kind of searing specificity of a Taylor Swift detail-oriented record. I am pleading with her to work with new people. There is absolutely nothing new being done sonically on Tortured Poets, and I think that's its biggest crime. It could have been a real sonic vibe shift, but it's just more of the same Midnight's work. To conclude, I think that this is really kind of a make-or-break moment for Taylor in the next phase of her artistry. Artists tend to get less adventurous as they get older, and it's been a while since Taylor has taken the kind of risk that will allow people to alter their perception of her. In a certain sense, this is the most Taylor Swift album ever. It's full of persnickety details and Easter eggs that reveal clues and answer long-held questions and raise even more, but it also contains an artist that is capable of much more than this and needs some friction in order to actualize that potential. As a Taylor Swift fan, I am deeply content and very much well fed by this album, but as a critic, I yearn for an even brighter day. She has made more than enough great music to last a lifetime. Her legacy is made, but I know she has more to give. I believe in her capacity to transform, and I know she can do it again. The first step is the hardest part, and that's breaking away from something that works well and isn't broken to unlock a new and fresh layer of creativity that can't be unleashed in the mere ordinary. And so that is what I think that the critics and the Swifties are missing about the Tortured Poets department. Leave me a comment, let me know what you thought of this video. Thank you so much to Rocket Money for sponsoring it, and I will see you in my next video. Goodbye, Swifties.